Today's essay topic looks into the longevity of the game Part 2. While I covered secret rares as the first topic, I couldn't help but wonder about every other type of card. And as I looked into super rares, uncommons, and commons, well, this led me down the rabbit hole of overall, how long do cards last, and where are they today? The narrative of today's video is going to look at cards from the beginning of its release to now, and briefly glean by product to product which cards are still used to this day. Keep in mind that the overall arching theme of this video is to highlight that as the game progresses, there is a natural progression of power creep. But at the same time, after discussion with my locals and a few other players, Digimon has basically crafted rotation into the card game because of power creep. To emphasize this point, starter decks are one of the simplest ways for players to get into the Digimon card game. And looking at the beginning of the card game, there were 3 starter decks in the form of Red Gaia, Blue Cocytus, and Heaven's Yellow. But now 4 years later, exactly which of these cards still see some play? Right off the bat, I want to say that vanilla Digimon for the most part see no play anymore. The cheap costs no longer provide any benefit, as the effects of Digimon can provide you additional value, or even an inheritable that helps you draw more cards, disrupt your opponent's tempo, or provide a buff of some kind. Which leads to the fact that at this point, every Red Gaia starter deck card is largely not played, save for starter deck Greymon. While this Digimon does give you a +1 security check, admittedly there aren't a lot of red decks that are currently topping. Greymon specifically has largely gone unnoticed for a few formats now, and the dominating red deck in more recent formats was Emperor Greymon. But now specifically, Birds has been making a lot of waves. When it comes to the Blue Cocytus starter deck, you have really only 3 cards that see some use, and that's mainly the option cards in the form of Hammerspark, Kaiser Nail, and Cocytus Breath. And lastly, for Heaven's Yellow, you have maybe 1 card that still sees play in the form of Patamon. In the grand scheme of things, this means that all these players who spent so much time hunting for these starter decks now have a return of roughly 11% of those cards 4 years later. The question, was it worth it? While true, some of these cards were useful for the meta at the time, I did this for not only these starter decks, but all of them. I expanded my research as far as the core and side sets as well, and the numbers were honestly very interesting. The next wave of starter decks with the green, black, and purple saw very similar results, but purple offered quite a few staples that were useful in decks like Purple Garurumon and more. Considering you have a slew of option cards that were definitely helpful, you had cards like Deathclaw and Nailbone that still see some play today. And while I'm going to fill in a lot of the numbers for starter decks 7 through 11, I'm most interested in the Jessamon starter deck, the Advanced Beelzemon starter deck, and of course, the most recent starter deck, Double Typhoon. When looking at these starter decks, these decks provided ample support for their archetypes, something that some of the first starter decks failed at because it was a hodgepodge of different monsters. And while there is some argument to the Dragon of Courage being similar to the Wolf of Friendship in many ways, the ultimate problem is, Greymon decks just aren't competitive at this time. So if you are a newer player looking to maximize value of your hard-earned money into 2 starter decks, the Beelzemon starter and Double Typhoon starters are the way to go. Because both of these decks provide you at minimum 70% of the deck that makes them viable to play with in today's format. And while I have been harping on starter decks, the next point of analysis is going to come down to the core sets. Exactly what is the utilization of cards from sets of old? And I'm going to tell you, going through over 2,000 cards became a very quick binary yes or no on whether I think a card is usable in today's format or competitive scene. You might argue differently, but I'll give you a gist of my thought process with some of the first sets and some of the newer sets. So going back to the beginning again, Special Booster 1.0 offered a total of 187 cards for players to collect, more than 1.5 times the number of cards you'd see in a typical core set today, out of which only 14 cards are still significantly used in the competitive scene today. You have cards like Magnet Angemon still being used for decks like Security Control. You have powerful tamer cards like Tai Kamiya, TK Takashi, Mimi Tachikawa, and Purple Engine cards. But that meant that overall, 7.5% of the cards were still being used to this day, most of which have been reprinted at this point in RB1 or other products. With 1.5, you had more Purple Engine cards and the most valuable blue tamer, Davis Motomiya. But when you look at the overall numbers from a set-by-set basis, you can see that overall, only about 20% of a set retains use. Arguably, I have Bt10 so high on percentage utilized because of the fact that cross-hard decks largely have their entire core engines built into the set. And this was something that started being more frequent with even sets like Battle of Omni, in which archetypes started seeing more prevalence. But now looking at later sets, there are reasons why EX5 and EX6 are so high in terms of percentage. With these two side sets, both introduce new decks that largely have their entire cores in the set. Take Animal Coliseum for example, in which you have decks like Force Sovereign and Leomon that were decent contenders in the meta. Infernal Ascension is no different in that, in my opinion, out of all the deck archetypes introduced in EX6 at this time, you have viability for a large portion of them from Ragnar Lordmon, Mastamon, 3 Great Angels, Diaboromon, and 7 Great Demon Lords. The only lackluster archetypes were, in my opinion, Dandevimon and Journey to the West. But when you look at the core sets themselves, this is where BT15 is marked lower to a degree because of the fact that there were 20 extra cards that see little to no play, and at the same time, restrictions caused a lot of the Dark Masters archetype to decrease in overall playability. BT14 Blast Ace is largely carried by the Yellow Vaccine and Lugumon support, while BT16 cards are honestly Imperial Dramon, the Ace top-end cards, and of course, in my mind, Digi-Police. Boiling it down, you can see the trends of sets becoming less utilized with time, meaning ultimately, when players talk about fear of rotation, the thing is, the Digimon card game is kind of a rotating card game. As sets naturally drop, a new card will lay waste to old decks, forcing you to play the new ones. While you may be gathering up all your alt arts right now for certain decks, whether it be 7 Great Demon Lords, Machine Dramon, Mastamon, or even Fenrir Lugumon, you do have to consider that while you may be paying $500 or $700 for those SP rares, knowing what's coming in the future is also a tall tale sign that the deck will be power crept out. While you do want that Ogudamon, with Paladin Mode Ace making its appearance in BT17, the trash is no longer a safe place for purple decks to do as they please. And while Shota will be an excellent addition to many decks, only time will tell what's the next best deck in the format. What did you think of today's discussion in regards to analyzing the products of the Digimon card game and how they've become lost in the sands of time? Let me know your thoughts on what you thought was interesting, because I honestly did not think some of the utilization percentages would be so high, and others so low. This is DIGI-PANDA, logging out.